Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Sojourning Writer. Last time when we talked about world building, we discussed the idea of migration and how people moved from one area to the other, and the culture clashes that take place between people who just a few years before had been the same. Today we will be taking a look at the early conflict between the Incan Empire, representing one of the first Native American civilizations, and the Spanish conquistadors. Guns, Germs, and Steels, The Fate of Human Societies by Jared Diamond. Chapter 3. Collision in Kalamahara. The first dramatic moment in the subsequent European-Native American relations was the first encounter between the Inca Emperor Atahualpa and the Spanish conquistador Francisco Pizarro in the Peruvian highland town of Cajamarquilla on November 16th, 1532. Atahualpa was the absolute monarch of the largest and most advanced state in the New World, while Pizarro represented the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV, also known as King Charles I of Spain, monarch of the most powerful state in Europe. Atahualpa's capture was decisive for the European conquest of the Inca Empire. Although the Spanish superior weapons would have assured an ultimate Spanish victory in any case, the capture made the conquest quicker and infinitely easier. A little bit about the Incan Empire. There were a number of small tribes that had grown up to encompass not only just a lot of land, but could also conquer other tribes. At its height, it was the largest empire in the pre-Columbian or pre-contact Americas. As Columbus arrived in the Caribbean in 1492, this marked 40 years between his arrival and the contact between the Incan Empire. The taking of Panama having taken place in 1512, only 20 years prior. Something we need to keep in mind is that the trip between Spain and the Caribbean could take months, which means factoring in resources like water and food for the trip, something we tend to forget in the days of roadside rest stops. Atahualpa was revered by the Incas as a sun god and exercised absolute authority over his subjects, who obeyed even the orders he issued from captivity. The months until his death gave Pizarro time to dispatch exploring parties unmolested to other parts of the Inca Empire, and to send for reinforcements from Panama. When fighting between the Spaniards and Incas finally did commence out of Atahualpa's execution, the Spanish forces were much more formidable. In addition to allowing his men to roam without fear of attack, the Spanish also demanded a massive ransom from the Inca Empire, which would be roughly worth $80 billion in today's currency. As a reference, the ransom for the French king after the Battle of Poitiers was $433 million. Needless to say, the gold wasn't the primary goal for the ransom, but the reason they were able to do this is because Atahualpa had been seen as an absolute monarch, and his orders were not to be questioned, only followed. As the Spanish believed that God was on their side, they did not hesitate to do whatever they felt they needed to do to win. What this meant was the Spanish were able to exploit the weaknesses in the Incan systems, one which created by a hierarchical system sort of like a Jenga tower. And while the Aztecs fell into a similar conflict with the Spanish, because in part their system wasn't so rigid, they were able to fight back against the Spanish, though the cost of that fight was the destruction of their city, Tenochtitlan. Why did Pizarro capture Atahualpa? Pizarro's military advantage lay in the Spaniards' steel swords and other weapons, steel armor, guns, and horses. To those weapons, Atahualpa's troops, without animals on which to ride into battle, could oppose only stone, bronze, or wooden clubs, maces, and hand axes, plus slingshots and quilted armor. Such imbalances of equipment were decisive in innumerable other confrontations of the Europeans with the Native Americans and other peoples. Technology is one of the primary driving force when it came to how the conflict between the Spanish and the Incan Empire played out. But information on the other side had a lot to do with how the things played out. If we took a look at the idea of invasion from a superior technologically advanced culture, from an entertainment point of view, we get movies like Independence Day. But in cases we already had ideas of the capabilities, and as seen from deleted scenes, we had the ability to combat their tech on their own terms, giving humans the ability to strike back. This advantage was not present in the Incan Empire. The tremendous advantage that the Spanish gained from their horses leaped out to eyewitness accounts. Horsemen could easily outride Indian sentries before the sentries had time to warn the Incan troops behind them, and could ride down and kill Indians on foot. On Thursday, I will be going over a couple different ways we can write a story that mirrors this one, to help us give us complexity of what happened, but the fact that the Spanish had such an advantage as horses would be similar to what we'd seen in the movie The Battle for LA, and their drone/air support abilities. Just like with the Spanish, while a significant advantage was seen, there were times where horses were killed in battle. One such case is with the Aztecs. Something else to note that while some technology is able to be reproduced easily, animals are less able to be reproduced as time is a requirement. The same isn't the same with manufactured technology. The transformation of warfare by horses began with their domestication around 4000 BC in the steppes north of the Black Sea. Horses permitted people possessing them to cover far greater distances than possible on foot, to attack by surprise, and to flee before a superior defending force could be gathered. Their role in Mahara thus exemplifies a military weapon that remained potent for 6,000 years, until the early 20th century, and that was eventually applied on all continents. Not until the First World War did military dominance of cavalry finally end. When we consider the advantage that the Spaniards derived from horses, steel weapons, and armor against foot soldiers without metal, it should no longer surprise us that the Spaniards consistently won their battles against enormous odds. Something else to keep in mind is not only did the horses allow greater combat capabilities and economic benefits, but the idea of a massive animal on the American landmass was unheard of, the largest animals being the llama for that particular region. The psychological impact of a cavalry charge was huge in European combat, and was only made more potent in cases where they are unaware of such beasts. This, coupled with the fact that the Spanish armor allowed them to take hits that would have killed others, added to the impression of futility in combat against the Spanish. How did Atahualpa come to be in Mahara? Atahualpa and his army came to be at Mahara because they had just won decisive battles in a civil war that left the Incas divided and vulnerable. Pizarro quickly appreciated these diversions and exploited them. The reason for the civil war was that an epidemic of smallpox, spreading overland among South American Indians after its arrival with Spanish settlers in Panama and Colombia, had killed the Inca emperor Huayna Capac and most of his court around 1526, and immediately killed his designated heir, Niño Kyoshi. The phrase, "United we stand, yet divided we fall," sums up the issue with what happened with Atahualpa. There are times when events that take place outside of our control that leads us to conflict. For the Incans, this was the death of their empire, but for the Spanish, this was an unexpected reprieve that allowed them to exploit weaknesses. As writers, it's almost always better to have negative random occurrences rather than positive. When chance makes things easier, it reduces tension to the story without the hard work expected for the result. However, if the situation unexpectedly gets harder, we must make our characters work harder for that result that we want, making that emotional catharsis that much sweeter. Throughout the Americas, diseases introduced with Europeans spread from tribe to tribe far in advance of Europeans themselves, killing an estimated 95% of the pre-Columbian Native American population. The most populous and highly organized native societies of North America, the Mississippian chiefdoms, disappeared in that way between 1492 and the late 1600s, even before the Europeans themselves made their first settlement on the Mississippi River. While we're looking to avoid shortcuts and victories for our characters, we should also take into account realistic results of events. While the Spanish didn't plan their epidemic to wipe out 95% of the native population, this did allow a smaller cost for conquest. This did allow for a much smaller cost to the conquest in both men and material. It's easy to see that if the population hadn't dropped off, Europeans would have returned after being forced out initially, only for there to be wholesale slaughter by the edge of the sword rather than by sickness. Without the ability of Europeans to manufacture arms and to develop more complex civilizations, the native populations would have never been able to completely remove the threat of European invasion. I do not mean to imply, however, that the role of disease in history was confined to paving the way for European expansion. Malaria, yellow fever, and other diseases of tropical Africa, India, Southeast Asia, and New Guinea furnished the most important obstacle to European colonialization of those tropical areas. Of course, that's not to say the Europeans didn't have struggles in the areas they were trying to conquer. Beyond the combat, the sickness that resided in the areas that Europeans had no familiarity with were also diseases that was as deadly to them as smallpox had been to the native populations. How did Pizarro come to Calamajara? Why didn't Atahualpa instead try to conquer Spain? Pizarro came to Kalamjara by means of European maritime technology, which built the ships that took him across the Atlantic from Spain to Panama, and then in the Pacific from Panama to Peru. Lacking such technology, Atahualpa did not expand overseas out of South America. Due in part to ongoing conflicts to the Old World, this forced technology to develop much faster than it would have expected in the New World. This, coupled with the lack of future planning required for colder climates, meant that the future was often more on the minds of the people in those areas, whereas people in tropical climates and hunter-gatherer civilizations, agricultural growth was not as much of a pressing issue. A related factor bringing Spaniards to Peru was the existence of writing. Spain possessed it, while the Inca Empire did not. Information could be spread far more widely, more accurately, and in more detail by writing rather than it being transmitted by mouth. That information coming back to Spain from Columbus's voyage and from Cortez's conquest of Mexico sent Spaniards pouring into the New World. Letters and pamphlets supplied both the motivation and necessity detailed sailing directions. The first publicized report of Pizarro's exploits by his companion Captain Costabel de Menina was printed in Seville in April 1534, a mere 9 months after Atahualpa's execution. A major factor in the speed in the development is the written word. Being able to transmit not only across great distances, but also time, means that there's a greater accuracy and easy to distinguish between good information and bad information. Why did Atahualpa walk into the trap? In hindsight, we find it astonishing that Atahualpa marched into Pizarro's obvious trap at Cajamahira. The Spaniards who captured him were equally surprised at their success. The consequences of literacy are prominent in the ultimate explanation. The immediate explanation is that Atahualpa had very little information about the Spaniards, their military power, and their intent. He derived that scant information by word of mouth, mainly from an envoy who had visited Pizarro's force for 2 days while it was en route inland from the coast. That envoy saw the Spaniards at their most disorganized, told Atahualpa that they were not fighting men, and that he could tie them all up if given 200 Indians. Understandably, it never occurred to Atahualpa that the Spaniards were formidable and would attack him without provocation. Going back to regular conflicts between European powers, the ability to be exposed to a variety of situations gave the Spanish advantage. It is easier to believe that your scouts might not be seeing the whole truth if you are aware of situations in the past where it wasn't the case. But because the Incas were relying on their own narrow experience, they missed out on the truth of the threat that was to them. Atahualpa was not alone in these fatal miscalculations. Even after Atahualpa had been captured, Francisco Pizarro's brother, Hernando Pizarro, deceived Atahualpa's leading general, Chachuchima, commanding a large army, into delivering himself to the Spaniards. Chachuchima's miscalculations marked the turning point in the collapse of the Inca resistance, a moment almost as significant as the capture of Atahualpa himself. The Aztec emperor Montezuma miscalculated even more grossly when he took Cortez for a returning god, and admitted him and his tiny army into the Aztec capital Tenochtitlan. The result is that Cortez captured Montezuma and then went out to conquer Tenochtitlan and the Aztec Empire. Like I said, because the Incas did not have the breadth of collective experiences that the Europeans had access to via the written word, the Incans were much more susceptible to deception. Now, that does not mean that we are free of deception, but rather in our own cases, our biases can blind us to the truth. So in essence, while the native population had been deceived because they lacked information, for us, we could be deceived because we cannot tell fact from fiction. In short, literacy made the Spanish heirs of a huge body of knowledge about human behavior and history. By contrast, not only did Atahualpa not have conception of the Spanish themselves, and no personal experience of other invaders from overseas, we also had not even heard or read of similar threats to anyone anywhere else, anytime previously in history. That gulf of experience encouraged Pizarro to set his trap and Atahualpa to walk into it. We tend to forget the power of writing as we can access it every day, but as something we need to keep in mind is the result of having an illiterate culture interacting with a literate one. Thus, Pizarro's capture of Atahualpa illustrates the set of proximate factors that resulted in Europeans' colonization of the New World instead of the Native Americans colonizing Europe. Immediate reasons for Pizarro's success included military technology based on guns, steel weapons, and horses, infectious diseases endemic to Eurasia, European maritime technology, and centralized political organization of European states, and writing. The lack of technology would be a weakness in terms of both combat ability, but also information gathering. But we are still left with the fundamental question why all those immediate advantages lie more with Europe rather than the New World. Why weren't the Incas the ones to invent guns and steel swords, to be mounted on animals as fearsome as horses, to bear diseases which Europeans lack resistance, to develop ocean-going ships and advanced political organization, and be able to draw on the experience of thousands of years of written history? We will be going over in more detail the most likely reasons for why these things played out in the way they did, but something to keep in mind, that just because a culture hadn't gone through the process of development does not mean that they're genetically inferior, as some would push. Overall, the idea of complex factors of being why things play out in the way that they do is something that we need to keep in mind when we tell our stories. Of course, as I mentioned before, does that mean that everything we are thinking through when it comes to world building actually ends up on the page? But I believe if you keep these ideas in mind, you can create a world that lives and breathes just like our own. Okay, everybody, that's all I had for today. As always, I will be linking all the resources I use in the description below. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please leave them in the comments below. Also, be sure to check out the book for yourself. Until next time, bye.
I am a poor, wayfaring stranger. I'm traveling through this world of woe, yet there's no sickness, toil, nor danger in that bright land to which I go.